Harlequin by Bernard Cornwell, read by Sean Barrett. Many deadly battles have been fought, people slaughtered, churches robbed, souls destroyed, young women and virgins deflowered, respectable wives and widows dishonored. Towns, manors, and buildings burned, and robberies, cruelties, and ambushes committed on the highways. Justice has failed because of these things. The Christian faith has withered, and commerce has perished, and so many other wickednesses and horrid things have followed from these wars that they cannot be spoken, numbered, or written down. Jean II, King of France, 1360. Harlequin, probably derived from the old French Harlequin, a troop of the devil's horsemen. Prologue. The treasure of Hookton was stolen on Easter morning, 1342. It was a holy thing, a relic that hung from the church rafters, and it was extraordinary that so precious an object should have been kept in such an obscure village. Some folk said it had no business being there, that it should have been enshrined in a cathedral or some great abbey, while others, many others, said it was not genuine. Only fools denied that relics were faked. Glib men roamed the byways of England selling yellowed bones that were said to be from the fingers or toes or ribs of the blessed saints. And sometimes the bones were human, though more often they were from pigs or even deer. But still folk bought and prayed to the bones. "A man might as well pray to St. Guinevere," Father Ralph said, then snorted with mocking laughter. "They're praying to ham bones, the blessed pig!" It had been Father Ralph who had brought the treasure to Hookton, and he would not hear of it being taken away to a cathedral or abbey, and so for 8 years it hung in the small church, gathering dust and growing spider webs that shone silver when the sunlight slanted through the high window of the western tower. Sparrows perched on the treasure, and some mornings there were bats hanging from its shaft. It was rarely cleaned and hardly ever brought down, though once in a while Father Ralph would demand that ladders be fetched and the treasure be unhooked from its chains, and he would pray over it and stroke it. He never boasted of it. Other churches or monasteries possessing such a prize would have used it to attract pilgrims, but Father Ralph turned visitors away. "It is nothing," he would say if a stranger inquired after the relic. "A bauble, nothing." He became angry if the visitors persisted. "It is nothing, nothing, nothing." Father Ralph was a frightening man, even when he was not angry, but in his temper he was a wild-haired fiend, and his flaring anger protected the treasure, though Father Ralph himself believed that ignorance was its best protection, for if men did not know of it, then God would guard it. And so he did, for a time. Hookton's obscurity was the treasure's best protection. The tiny village lay on England's south coast, where the Lip, a stream that was almost a river, flowed to the sea across a shingle beach. A half-dozen fishing boats worked from the village, protected at night by the hook itself, which was a tongue of shingle that curved around the Lip's last reach, though in the famous storm of 1322 the sea had roared across the hook and pounded the boats to splinters on the upper beach. The village had never really recovered from that tragedy. 19 boats had sailed from the hook before the storm, but 20 years later only 6 small craft worked the waves beyond the Lip's treacherous bar. The rest of the villagers worked in the salt pans, or else herded sheep and cattle on the hills behind the huddle of thatched huts which clustered about the small stone church where the treasure hung from the blackened beams. That was Hookton, a place of boats, fish, salt and livestock, with green hills behind, ignorance within, and the wide sea beyond. Hookton, like every place in Christendom, held a vigil on the eve of Easter, and in 1342 that solemn duty was performed by 5 men who watched as Father Ralph consecrated the Easter sacraments and then laid the bread and wine on the white-draped altar. The wafers were in a simple clay bowl covered with a piece of bleached linen, while the wine was in a silver cup that belonged to Father Ralph. The silver cup was a part of his mystery. He was very tall, pious, and much too learned to be a village priest. It was rumored that he could have been a bishop, but that the devil had persecuted him with bad dreams, and it was certain that in the years before he came to Hookton, he had been locked in a monastery's cell because he was possessed by demons. Then, in 1334, the demons had left him, and he was sent to Hookton, where he terrified the villagers by preaching to the gulls, or pacing the beach, weeping for his sins, and striking his breast with sharp-edged stones. He howled like a dog when his wickedness weighed too heavily on his conscience, but he also found a kind of peace in the remote village. He built a large house of timber, which he shared with his housekeeper, and he made friends with Sir Giles Marriott, who was the lord of Hookton, and lived in a stone hall 3 miles to the north. Sir Giles, of course, was a gentleman, and so, it seemed, was Father Ralph, despite his wild hair and angry voice. He collected books, which, after the treasure he had brought to the church, were the greatest marvels in Hookton. Sometimes, when he left his door open, people would just gape at the 17 books that were bound in leather and piled on a table. Most were in Latin, but a handful were in French, which was Father Ralph's native tongue. Not the French of France, but Norman French, the language of England's rulers, and the villagers reckoned their priest must be nobly born, though none dared ask him to his face. They were all too scared of him. But he did his duty by them. He christened them, churched them, married them, heard their confessions, absolved them, scolded them, and buried them. But he did not pass the time with them. He walked alone, grim-faced, hair awry and eyes glowering, but the villagers were still proud of him. Most country churches suffered ignorant, pudding-faced priests who were scarce more educated than their parishioners, but Hookton, in Father Ralph, had a proper scholar, too clever to be sociable, perhaps a saint, maybe of noble birth, a self-confessed sinner, probably mad, but undeniably a real priest. Father Ralph blessed the sacraments, then warned the 5 men that Lucifer was abroad on the night before Easter, and that the devil wanted nothing so much as to snatch the holy sacraments from the altar, and so the 5 men must guard the bread and wine diligently. And for a short time after the priest had left, they dutifully stayed on their knees, gazing at the chalice, which had an armorial badge engraved in its silver flank. The badge showed a mythical beast, a Yale, holding a Grail, and it was that noble device which suggested to the villagers that Father Ralph was indeed a high-born man who had fallen low through being possessed of devils. The silver chalice seemed to shimmer in the light of 2 immensely tall candles, which would burn through the whole long night. Most villages could not afford proper Easter candles, but Father Ralph purchased 2 from the monks at Shaftesbury every year, and the villagers would sidle into the church to stare at them. But that night, after dark, only the 5 men saw the tall, unwavering flames. Then John, a fisherman, farted. "Reckon that's ripe enough to keep the old devil away," he said, and the other 4 laughed. Then they all abandoned the chancel steps and sat with their backs against the nave wall. John's wife had provided a basket of bread, cheese, and smoked fish, while Edward, who owned a salt works on the beach, had brought ale. In the bigger churches of Christendom, knights kept this annual vigil. They knelt in full armor, their surcoats embroidered with prancing lions and stooping hawks, and axe heads and spread-wing eagles, and their helmets mounted with feathered crests. But there were no knights in Hookton, and only the youngest man, who was called Thomas, and who sat slightly apart from the other 4, had a weapon. It was an ancient, blunt, and slightly rusted sword. "You reckon that old blade will scare the devil, Thomas?" John asked him. "My father said I had to bring it," Thomas said. "What does your father want with a sword?" "He throws nothing away, you know that," Thomas said, hefting the old weapon. It was heavy, but he lifted it easily. At 18, he was tall and immensely strong. He was well liked in Hookton, for, despite being the son of the village's richest man, he was a hard-working boy. He loved nothing better than a day at sea, hauling tarred nets that left his hands raw and bleeding. He knew how to sail a boat, had the strength to pull a good oar when the wind failed. He could lay snares, shoot a bow, dig a grave, geld a calf, lay thatch, or cut hay all day long. He was a big, bony, black-haired country boy, but God had given him a father who wanted Thomas to rise above common things. He wanted the boy to be a priest, which was why Thomas had just finished his first term at Oxford. "What do you do at Oxford, Thomas?" Edward asked him. "Everything I shouldn't," Thomas said. He pushed black hair away from his face that was bony like his father's. He had very blue eyes, a long jaw, slightly hooded eyes, and a swift smile. The girls in the village reckoned him handsome. "Do they have girls at Oxford?" John asked slyly. "More than enough," Thomas said. "Don't tell your father that," Edward said, "or he'll be whipping you again. A good man with a whip, your father." "There's none better," Thomas agreed. "He only wants the best for you," John said. "Can't blame a man for that." Thomas did blame his father. He had always blamed his father. He had fought his father for years, and nothing so raised the anger between them as Thomas's obsession with bows. His mother's father had been a bowyer in the Weald, and Thomas had lived with his grandfather until he was nearly 10. Then his father had brought him to Hookton, where he had met Sir Giles Marriott's huntsman, another man skilled in archery, and the huntsman had become his new tutor. Thomas had made his first bow at 11, but when his father found the elmwood weapon, he had broken it across his knee and used the remnants to thrash his son. "You are not a common man," his father had shouted, beating the splintered staves on Thomas's back and head and legs. But neither the words nor the thrashing did any good. And as Thomas's father was usually preoccupied with other things, Thomas had plenty of time to pursue his obsession. By 15, he was as good a bowyer as his grandfather, knowing instinctively how to shape a stave of yew so that the inner belly came from the dense heartwood, while the front was made of the springier sapwood. And when the bow was bent, the heartwood was always trying to return to the straight, and the sapwood was the muscle that made it possible. To Thomas's quick mind, there was something elegant, simple, and beautiful about a good bow. Smooth and strong, a good bow was like a girl's flat belly. And that night, keeping the Easter vigil in Hookton Church, Thomas was reminded of Jane, who served in the village's small alehouse. John, Edward, and the other two men had been speaking of village things: the price of lambs at Dorchester Fair, the old fox up on Lip Hill that had taken a whole flock of geese in one night, and the angel who had been seen over the rooftops at Lyme. "I reckon they's been drinking too much," Edward said. "I sees angels when I drink," John said. "That be Jane," Edward said. "Looks like an angel, she does." "Don't behave like one," John said. "Lass is pregnant." And all four men looked at Thomas, who stared innocently up at the treasure hanging from the rafters. In truth, Thomas was frightened that the child was indeed his, and terrified of what his father would say when he found out, but he pretended ignorance of Jane's pregnancy that night. He just looked at the treasure that was half obscured by a fishing net hung up to dry, while the four older men gradually fell asleep. A cold draught flickered the twin candle flames. A dog howled somewhere in the village, and always, never-ending, Thomas could hear the sea's heartbeat as the waves thumped on the shingle, then scraped back, paused, and thumped again. He listened to the four men snoring, and he prayed that his father would never find out about Jane, though that was unlikely, for she was pressing Thomas to marry her, and he did not know what to do. Maybe, he thought, he should just run away, take Jane and his bow and run. But he felt no certainty, and so he just gazed at the relic in the church roof and prayed to its saint for help. The treasure was a lance. It was a huge thing, with a shaft as thick as a man's forearm and twice the length of a man's height, and probably made of ash, though it was so old no one could really say, and age had bent the blackened shaft out of true, though not by much, and its tip was not an iron or steel blade, but a wedge of tarnished silver, which tapered to a bodkin's point. The shaft did not swell to protect the hand grip, but was smooth like a spear or a goad. Indeed, the relic looked very like an oversized ox goad, but no farmer would ever tip an ox goad with silver. This was a weapon, a lance. But it was not any old lance. This was the very lance which St. George had used to kill the dragon. It was England's lance, for St. George was England's saint, and that made it a very great treasure, even if it did hang in Hookton's spidery church roof. There were plenty of folk who said it could not have been St. George's lance, but Thomas believed it was, and he liked to imagine the dust churned by the hooves of St. George's horse, and the dragon's breath streaming in hellish flame as the horse reared and the saint drew back the lance. The sunlight, bright as an angel's wing, would have been flaring about St. George's helmet, and Thomas imagined the dragon's roar, the thrash of its scale-hooked tail, the horse screaming in terror, and he saw the saint stand in his stirrups before plunging the lance's silver tip down through the monster's armored hide. Straight to the heart the lance went, and the dragon's squeals would have rung to heaven as it writhed and bled and died. Then the dust would have settled, and the dragon's blood would have crusted on the desert sand, and St. George must have hauled the lance free, and somehow it ended up in Father Ralph's possession. But how? The priest would not say. But there it hung, a great dark lance, heavy enough to shatter a dragon's scales. So that night Thomas prayed to St. George, while Jane, the black-haired beauty whose belly was just rounding with her unborn child, slept in the tap-room of the alehouse, and Father Ralph cried aloud in his nightmare for fear of the demons that circled in the dark, and the vixens screamed on the hill as the endless waves clawed and sucked at the shingle on the hook. It was the night before Easter. Thomas woke to the sound of the village cockerels and saw that the expensive candles had burned down almost to their pewter holders. A grey light filled the window above the white-fronted altar. One day Father Ralph had promised the village that window would be a blaze of coloured glass, showing St. George skewering the dragon with a silver-headed lance. But for now the stone frame was filled with horn panes that turned the air within the church as yellow as urine. Thomas stood, needing to piss, and the first awful screams sounded from the village. For Easter had come, Christ was risen, and the French were ashore. The raiders came from Normandy in 4 boats that had sailed the night's west wind. Their leader, Sir Guillaume d'Evêque, the Sieur d'Evêque, was a seasoned warrior who had fought the English in Gascony and Flanders and had twice led raids on England's southern coast. Both times he had brought his boats safe home with cargoes of wool, silver, livestock, and women. He lived in a fine stone house on Caen's Ile Saint-Jean, where he was known as the Knight of the Sea and of the Land. He was 30 years old, broad in the chest, wind-burned and fair-haired, a cheerful, unreflective man who made his living by piracy at sea and night service on shore. And now he had come to Hookton. It was an insignificant place, hardly likely to yield any great reward, but Sir Guillaume had been hired for the task, and if he failed at Hookton, if he did not snatch so much as one single poor coin from a villager, he would still make his profit, for he had been promised 1,000 livres for this expedition. The contract was signed and sealed, and it promised Sir Guillaume the 1,000 livres, together with any other plunder he could find in Hookton. 100 livres had already been paid, and the rest was in the keeping of Brother Martin in Caen's Abbey aux Hommes, and all Sir Guillaume had to do to earn the remaining 900 livres was to bring his boats to Hookton, take what he wanted, but leave the church's contents to the man who had offered him such a generous contract. That man now stood beside Sir Guillaume in the leading boat. He was a young man, not yet 30, tall and black-haired, who spoke rarely and smiled less. He wore an expensive coat of mail that fell to his knees, and over it a surcoat of deep black linen that bore no badge, though Sir Guillaume guessed the man was nobly born, for he had the arrogance of rank and the confidence of privilege. He was certainly not a Norman noble, for Sir Guillaume knew all those men, and Sir Guillaume doubted the young man came from nearby Alençon or Maine, for he had ridden with those forces often enough. But the sallow cast of the stranger's skin suggested he came from one of the Mediterranean provinces, from Languedoc, perhaps, or Dauphine, and they were all mad down there, mad as dogs. Sir Guillaume did not even know the man's name. "Some men call me the Harlequin," the stranger had answered when Sir Guillaume had asked. "Harlequin?" Sir Guillaume had repeated the name, then made the sign of the cross. for such a name was hardly a boast. "You mean like the Harlequin?" "Harlequin in France," the man had allowed, "but in Italy they say Harlequin. It is all the same." The man had smiled, and something about that smile had suggested Sir Guillaume had best curb his curiosity if he wanted to receive the remaining 900 livres. The man who called himself the Harlequin now stared at the misty shore, where a stumpy church tower, a huddle of vague roofs, and a smear of smoke from the smouldering fires of the salt pans just showed. "Is that Hookton?" he asked. "So he says," Sir Guillaume answered, jerking his head at the shipmaster. "Then God have mercy on it," the man said. He drew his sword, even though the 4 boats were still a half-mile from shore. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired for the voyage, made the sign of the cross, then began winding their cords, as Sir Guillaume ordered his banner raised to the masthead. It was a blue flag decorated with 3 stooping yellow hawks that had outspread wings and claws hooked, ready to savage their prey. Sir Guillaume could smell the salt fires and hear the cockerels crowing ashore. The cockerels were still crowing as the bows of his 4 ships ran onto the shingle. Sir Guillaume and the Harlequin were the first ashore, but after them came a score of Genoese crossbowmen who were professional soldiers and knew their business. Their leader took them up the beach and through the village to block the valley beyond, where they would stop any of the villagers escaping with their valuables. Sir Guillaume's remaining men would ransack the houses, while the sailors stayed on the beach to guard their ships. It had been a long, cold, and anxious night at sea, but now came the reward. 40 men-at-arms invaded Hookton. They wore close-fitting helmets and had mail shirts over leather-backed hacktons. They carried swords, axes, or spears, and they were released to plunder. Most were veterans of Sir Guillaume's other raids and knew just what to do. Kick in the flimsy doors and start killing the men. Let the women scream, but kill the men, for it was the men who would fight back hardest. Some women ran, but the Genoese crossbowmen were there to stop them. Once the men were dead, the plundering could begin, and that took time, for peasants everywhere hid whatever was valuable, and the hiding places had to be ferreted out. Thatch had to be pulled down, wells explored, floors probed. But plenty of things were not hidden. There were hams waiting for the first meal after Lent, racks of smoked or dried fish, piles of nets, good cooking pots, distaffs and spindles, eggs, butter churns, casks of salt, all humble enough things, but sufficiently valuable to take back to Normandy. Some houses yielded small hoards of coins, and one house, the priest's, was a treasure trove of silver plate, candlesticks, and jugs. There were even some good bolts of woolen cloth in the priest's house, and a great carved bed, and a decent horse in the stable. Sir Guillaume looked at the 17 books, but decided they were worthless, and so, having wrenched the bronze locks from the leather covers, he left them to burn when the houses were fired. He had to kill the priest's housekeeper. He regretted that death. Sir Guillaume was not squeamish about killing women, but their deaths brought no honor, and so he discouraged such slaughter unless the woman caused trouble, and the priest's housekeeper wanted to fight. She slashed at Sir Guillaume's men-at-arms with a roasting spit, called them sons of whores and devil's grubs, and in the end Sir Guillaume cut her down with his sword because she would not accept her fate. "Stupid bitch," Sir Guillaume said, stepping over her body to peer into the hearth. 2 fine hams were being smoked in the chimney. "Pull them down," he ordered one of his men, then left them to search the house while he went to the church. Father Ralph, woken by the screams of his parishioners, had pulled on a cassock and run to the church. Sir Guillaume's men had left him alone out of respect, but once inside the little church, the priest had begun to hit the invaders until the Harlequin arrived and snarled at the men-at-arms to hold the priest. They seized his arms and held him in front of the altar, with its white Easter frontal. The Harlequin, his sword in his hand, bowed to Father Ralph. "My lord Count," he said. Father Ralph closed his eyes, perhaps in prayer, though it looked more like exasperation. He opened them and gazed into the Harlequin's handsome face. "You are my brother's son," he said, and did not sound mad at all, merely full of regret. "True. How is your father? Dead, the Harlequin said, as is his father and yours. God rest their souls, Father Ralph said piously. And when you are dead, old man, I shall be the Count, and our family will rise again. Father Ralph half smiled, then just shook his head and looked up at the lance. It will do you no good, he said, for its power is reserved for virtuous men. It will not work for evil filth like you. Then Father Ralph gave a curious mewing noise as the breath rushed from him, and he stared down to where his nephew had run the sword into his belly. He struggled to speak, but no words came. Then he collapsed as the men-at-arms released him, and he slumped by the altar with blood puddling in his lap. The Harlequin wiped his sword on the wine-stained altar cloth, then ordered one of Sir Guillaume's men to find a ladder. A ladder? The man-at-arms asked in confusion. They thatch their roofs, don't they? So they have a ladder. Find it. The Harlequin sheathed his sword, then stared up at the lance of St. George. I have put a curse on it. Father Ralph spoke faintly. He was pale-faced, dying, but sounded oddly calm. Your curse, my lord, worries me as much as a tavern maid's fart. The Harlequin tossed the pewter candlesticks to a man-at-arms, then scooped the wafers from the clay bowl and crammed them into his mouth. He picked up the bowl, peered at its darkened surface, and reckoned it was a thing of no value, so left it on the altar. Where's the wine? He asked Father Ralph. Father Ralph shook his head. Galix meus inebrians, he said, and the Harlequin just laughed. Father Ralph closed his eyes as the pain griped his belly. Oh, God, he moaned. The Harlequin crouched by his uncle's side. Does it hurt? Like fire, Father Ralph said. You will burn in hell, my lord, the Harlequin said, and he saw how Father Ralph was clutching his wounded belly to staunch the flow of blood, and so he pulled the priest's hands away and then, standing, kicked him hard in the stomach. Father Ralph gasped with pain and curled his body. A gift from your family, the Harlequin said, then turned away as a ladder was brought into the church. The village was filled with screams, for most of the women and children were still alive, and their ordeal had scarcely begun. All the younger women were briskly raped by Sir Guillaume's men, and the prettiest of them, including Jane from the alehouse, were taken to the boats so they could be carried back to Normandy to become the whores or wives of Sir Guillaume's soldiers. One of the women screamed because her baby was still in her house, but the soldiers did not understand her, and they struck her to silence, then pushed her into the hands of the sailors, who lay her on the shingle and lifted her skirts. She wept inconsolably as her house burned. Geese, pigs, goats, 6 cows, and the priest's good horse were herded towards the boats, while the white gulls rode the sky, crying. End of Side 1. Side 2. The sun had scarcely risen above the eastern hills, and the village had already yielded more than Sir Guillaume had dared hope for. We could go inland, the captain of his Genoese crossbowmen suggested. We have what we came for, the black-dressed Harlequin intervened. He had placed the unwieldy lance of St. George on the graveyard grass, and now stared at the ancient weapon as though he was trying to understand its power. What is it? The Genoese crossbowman asked. Nothing that is of use to you. Sir Guillaume grinned. Strike a blow with that, he said, and it'll shatter like ivory. The Harlequin shrugged. He had found what he wanted, and Sir Guillaume's opinion was of no interest. Go inland, the Genoese captain suggested again. A few miles, maybe, Sir Guillaume said. He knew that the dreaded English archers would eventually come to Hookton, but probably not till midday, and he wondered if there was another village close by that would be worth plundering. He watched a terrified girl, maybe 11 years old, being carried towards the beach by a soldier. How many dead? He asked. Ours? The Genoese captain seemed surprised by the question. None. Not ours, theirs. 30 men, 40, a few women. And we haven't taken a scratch, Sir Guillaume exulted. Pity to stop now? He looked at his employer, but the man in black did not seem to care what they did, while the Genoese captain just grunted, which surprised Sir Guillaume, for he thought the man was eager to extend the raid. But then he saw that the man's sullen grunt was not caused by any lack of enthusiasm, but by a white-feathered arrow that had buried itself in his breast. The arrow had slit through the mail shirt and the padded Hookton like a bodkin sliding through linen, killing the crossbowman almost instantly. Sir Guillaume dropped flat, and a heartbeat later another arrow whipped above him to thump into the turf. The Harlequin snatched up the lance and was running towards the beach, while Sir Guillaume scrambled into the shelter of the church porch. "Crossbows!" he shouted. "Crossbows!" Because someone was fighting back. Thomas had heard the screams, and, like the other 4 men in the church, he had gone to the door to see what they meant. But no sooner had they reached the porch than a band of armed men, their mail and helmets dark grey in the dawn, appeared in the graveyard. Edward slammed the church door, dropped the bar into its brackets, then crossed himself. "Sweet Jesus," he said in astonishment, then flinched as an axe thumped into the door. "Give me that!" He seized the sword from Thomas. Thomas let him take it. The church door was shaking now, as 2 or 3 axes attacked the old wood. The villagers had always reckoned that Hookton was much too small to be raided, but the church door was splintering in front of Thomas's eyes, and he knew it must be the French. Tales were told up and down the coast of such landings, and prayers were said to keep folk from the raids. But the enemy was here, and the church echoed with the crash of their axe blows. Thomas was in panic, but did not know it. He just knew he had to escape from the church, and so he ran and jumped onto the altar. He crushed the silver chalice with his right foot and kicked it off the altar as he climbed onto the sill of the great east window, where he beat at the yellow panes, shattering the horn down into the churchyard. He saw men in red and green jackets running past the alehouse, but none looked his way as he jumped down into the churchyard and ran to the ditch, where he ripped his clothes as he wriggled through the thorn hedge on the other side. He crossed the lane, jumped the fence of his father's garden, and hammered on the kitchen door. But no one responded, and a crossbow bolt smacked into the lintel just inches from his face. Thomas ducked and ran through the bean plants to the cattle shed where his father stabled a horse. There was no time to rescue the beast, so instead Thomas climbed into the hayloft where he hid his bow and arrows. A woman screamed close by. Dogs were howling. The French were shouting as they kicked down doors. Thomas seized his bow and arrow bag, ripped the thatch away from the rafters, squeezed through the gap, and dropped into the neighbor's orchard. He ran as though the devil was on his heels. A crossbow bolt thumped into the turf as he came to Lip Hill, and 2 of the Genoese archers started to follow him. But Thomas was young and tall and strong and fast. He ran uphill through a pasture bright with cowslips and daisies, leaped a hurdle that blocked a gap in a hedge, then twisted right towards the hill's crest. He went as far as the wood on the hill's far side, and there he dropped to catch his breath amidst a slope drifted with a haze of bluebells. He lay there, listening to the lambs in a nearby field. He waited, hearing nothing untoward. The crossbowmen had abandoned their pursuit. Thomas lay in the bluebells for a long time, but at last he crept cautiously back to the hilltop, from where he could see a straggle of old women and children scattering on the further hill. These folk had somehow evaded the crossbowmen, and would doubtless flee north to warn Sir Giles Marriott, but Thomas did not join them. Instead, he worked his way down to a hazel copse, where dog's mercury bloomed, and from where he could see his village dying. Men were carrying plunder to the 4 strange boats that were grounded on the Hook's shingle. The first thatch was being fired. 2 dogs lay dead in the street beside a woman, quite naked, who was being held down while Frenchmen hitched up their mail shirts to take their turns with her. Thomas remembered how, not long ago, she had married a fisherman whose first wife had died in childbirth. She had been so coy and happy, but now, when she tried to crawl off the road, a Frenchman kicked her in the head, then bent with laughter. Thomas saw Jane, the girl he feared he had made pregnant, being dragged towards the boats, and was ashamed that he felt a sense of relief that he would not have to confront his father with her news. More cottages were fired as Frenchmen hurled burning straw onto their thatch, and Thomas watched the smoke curl and thicken, then worked his way through the hazel saplings to a place where hawthorn blossom was thick, white, and concealing. It was there he strung his bow. It was the best bow he had ever made. It had been cut from a stave that had washed ashore from a ship that had foundered in the Channel. A dozen staves had come to Hookton's shingle on the south wind, and Sir Giles Marriott's huntsman reckoned they must have been Italian yew, for it was the most beautiful wood he had ever seen. Thomas had sold 11 of the tight-grained staves in Dorchester, but kept the best one. He carved it, steamed the ends to give them a slight bend against the wood's grain, then painted the bow with a mix of soot and flaxseed oil. He had boiled the mix in his mother's kitchen on days when his father was away, and Thomas's father had never known what he was doing, though sometimes he would complain of the smell, and Thomas's mother would say she had been making a potion to poison the rats. The bow had to be painted to stop it from drying out, for then the wood would become brittle and shatter under the stress of the taut string. The paint had dried a deep golden color, just like the bows Thomas's grandfather used to make in the Weald. But Thomas had wanted it to be darker, and so he had rubbed more soot into the wood and smeared it with beeswax, and he'd gone on doing it for a fortnight, until the bow was as black as the shaft of St. George's lance. He tipped the bow with 2 pieces of knocked horn to hold a cord that was made from woven hemp strands that had been soaked in hoof glue. Then he'd whipped the cord where the arrow would rest with still more hemp. He'd stolen coins from his father to buy arrowheads in Dorchester, then made the shafts from ash and goose feathers, and on that Easter morning he had 23 of those good arrows in his bag. Thomas strung the bow, took a white-fledged arrow from the bag, then looked at the 3 men beside the church. They were a long way off, but the black bow was as big a weapon as any ever made, and the power in its yew belly was awesome. One of the men had a simple mail coat, another a plain black surcoat, while the third had a red and green jacket over his mail shirt, and Thomas decided that the most gaudily dressed man must be the raid's leader, and so he should die. Thomas's left hand shook as he drew the bow. He was dry-mouthed, frightened. He knew he would shoot wild, so he lowered his arm and released the cord's tension. "Remember," he told himself, "remember everything you have ever been taught. An archer does not aim, he kills. It is all in the head, in the arms, in the eyes, and killing a man is no different from shooting a hind. Draw and loose, that was all, and that was why he had practiced for over 10 years, so that the act of drawing and loosing was as natural as breathing and as fluent as water flowing from a spring. Look and loose, do not think. Draw the string and let God guide the arrow." Smoke thickened above Hookton, and Thomas felt an immense anger surge like a black humor, and he pushed his left hand forward and drew back with the right, and he never took his eyes off the red and green coat. He drew till the cord was beside his right ear, and then he loosed. That was the first time Thomas of Hookton ever shot an arrow at a man, and he knew it was good as soon as it leaped from the string, for the bow did not quiver. The arrow flew true, and he watched it curve down, sinking from the hill to strike the green and red coat hard and deep. He let a second arrow fly, but the man in the mail coat dropped and scurried to the church porch, while the third man picked up the lance and ran towards the beach, where he was hidden by the smoke. Thomas had 21 arrows left, 1 each for the Holy Trinity, he thought, and another for every year of his life, and that life was threatened, for a dozen crossbowmen were running towards the hill. He loosed a third arrow, then ran back through the hazels. He was suddenly exultant, filled with a sense of power and satisfaction. In that one instant, as the first arrow slid into the sky, he knew he wanted nothing more from life. He was an archer. Oxford could go to hell for all he cared, for Thomas had found his joy. He whooped with delight as he ran uphill. Crossbow bolts ripped through the hazel leaves, and he noted that they made a deep, almost humming noise as they flew. Then he was over the hill's crest, where he ran west for a few yards before doubling back to the summit. He paused long enough to loose another arrow, then turned and ran again. Thomas led the Genoese crossbowmen a dance of death, from hill to hedgerow, along paths he had known since childhood, and like fools they followed him, because their pride would not let them admit that they were beaten. But beaten they were, and 2 died before a trumpet sounded from the beach, summoning the raiders to their boats. The Genoese turned away then, stopping only to fetch the weapon, pouches, mail, and coat of one of their dead, but Thomas killed another of them as they stooped over the body, and this time the survivors just ran from him. Thomas followed them down to the smoke-palled village. He ran past the alehouse, which was an inferno, and so to the shingle where the 4 boats were being shoved into the sea reach. The sailors pushed off with long oars, then pulled out to sea. They towed the best 3 Hookton boats and left the others burning. The village was also burning, its thatch whirling into the sky in sparks and smoke and flaming scraps. Thomas shot one last useless arrow from the beach and watched it plunge into the sea short of the escaping raiders. Then he turned away and went back through the stinking, burning, bloody village to the church, which was the only building the raiders had not set alight. The 4 companions of his vigil were dead, but Father Ralph still lived. He was sitting with his back against the altar. The bottom of his gown was dark with fresh blood, and his long face was unnaturally white. Thomas kneeled beside the priest. "Father?" Father Ralph opened his eyes and saw the bow. He grimaced, though whether in pain or disapproval Thomas could not tell. "Did you kill any of them, Thomas?" the priest asked. "Yes," Thomas said, "a lot." Father Ralph grimaced and shuddered. Thomas reckoned the priest was one of the strongest men he had ever known, flawed perhaps, yet tough as a yew-stave. But he was dying now, and there was a whimper in his voice. "You don't want to be a priest, do you, Thomas?" He asked the question in French, his mother tongue. "No," Thomas answered in the same language. "You're going to be a soldier," the priest said, "like your grandfather." He paused and whimpered as another bolt of pain ripped up from his belly. Thomas wanted to help him, but in truth there was nothing to be done. The Harlequin had run his sword into Father Ralph's belly, and only God could save the priest now. "I argued with my father," the dying man said, "and he disowned me. He disinherited me, and I have refused to acknowledge him from that day to this. But you, Thomas, you are like him, very like him, and you have always argued with me." "Yes, Father," Thomas said. He took his father's hand, and the priest did not resist. "I loved your mother," Father Ralph said, "and that was my sin, and you are the fruit of that sin. I thought if you became a priest, you could rise above sin. It floods us, Thomas. It floods us. It is everywhere. I have seen the devil, Thomas, seen him with my own eyes, and we must fight him. Only the church can do that. Only the church." The tears flowed down his hollow, unshaven cheeks. He looked past Thomas into the roof of the nave. "They stole the lance," he said sadly. "I know. My great-grandfather brought it from the Holy Land," Father Ralph said. "And I stole it from my father, and my brother's son stole it from us today." He spoke softly. "He will do evil with it. Bring it home, Thomas. Bring it home." "I will," Thomas promised him. Smoke began to thicken in the church. The raiders had not fired it, but the thatch was catching the flames from the burning scraps that filled the air. "You say your brother's son stole it?" Thomas asked. "Your cousin," Father Ralph whispered, his eyes closed. "The one dressed in black. He came and stole it." "Who is he?" Thomas asked. "Evil," Father Ralph said. "Evil." He moaned and shook his head. "Who is he?" Thomas insisted. Calix meus inebrians, Father Ralph said in a voice scarce above a whisper. Thomas knew it was a line from a psalm and meant, "My cup makes me drunk," and he reckoned his father's mind was slipping as his soul hovered close to his body's end. "Tell me who your father was," Thomas demanded. "Tell me who I am," he wanted to say. "Tell me who you are, Father." But Father Ralph's eyes were closed, though he still gripped Thomas's hand hard. "Father?" Thomas asked. The smoke dipped in the church and sifted out through the window Thomas had broken to make his escape. "Father?" But his father never spoke again. He died, and Thomas, who had fought against him all his life, wept like a child. At times he had been ashamed of his father, but in that smoky Easter morning he learned that he loved him. Most priests disowned their children, but Father Ralph had never hidden Thomas. He had let the world think what it wanted, and he had freely confessed to being a man as well as a priest, and if he sinned in loving his housekeeper, then it was a sweet sin that he never denied, even if he did say acts of contrition for it, and feared that in the life hereafter he would be punished for it. Thomas pulled his father away from the altar. He did not want the body to be burned when the roof collapsed. The silver chalice that Thomas had accidentally crushed was under the dead man's blood-soaked robe, and Thomas pocketed it before dragging the corpse out into the graveyard. He lay his father beside the body of the man in the red and green coat, and Thomas crouched there, weeping, knowing that he had failed in his first Easter vigil. The devil had stolen the sacraments, and St. George's lance was gone, and Hookton was dead. At midday, Sir Giles Marriott came to the village with a score of men armed with bows and billhooks. Sir Giles himself wore mail and carried a sword, but there was no enemy left to fight, and Thomas was the only person left in the village. 3 yellow hawks on a blue field, Thomas told Sir Giles. Thomas? Sir Giles asked, puzzled. He was the lord of the manor and an old man now, though in his time he had carried a lance against both the Scots and the French. He had been a good friend to Thomas's father, but he did not understand Thomas, whom he reckoned had grown wild as a wolf. 3 yellow hawks on a blue field, Thomas said vengefully, are the arms of the man who did this? Were they the arms of his cousin? He did not know. There were so many questions left by his father. I don't know whose badge that is, Sir Giles said, but I shall pray by God's bowels he screams in hell for this work. There was nothing to be done until the fires had burned themselves out, and only then could the bodies be dragged from the ashes. The burned dead had been blackened and grotesquely shrunk by the heat, so that even the tallest men looked like children. The dead villagers were taken to the graveyard for a proper burial, but the bodies of the 4 crossbowmen were dragged down to the beach and there stripped naked. Did you do this? Sir Giles asked Thomas. Yes, sir. Then I thank you. My first dead Frenchman, Thomas said angrily. No, Sir Giles said, and he lifted one of the men's tunics to show Thomas the badge of a green chalice embroidered on its sleeve. They're from Genoa, Sir Giles said. The French hire them as crossbowmen. I've killed a few in my time, but there are always more where they come from. You know what the badge is? A cup? Sir Giles shook his head. The Holy Grail. They reckon they have it in their cathedral. I'm told it's a great green thing, carved from an emerald and brought back from the Crusades. I should like to see it one day. Then I shall bring it to you, Thomas said bitterly, just as I shall bring back our lance. Sir Giles stared to sea. The raiders' boats were long gone, and there was nothing out there but the sun on the waves. Why would they come here? He asked. For the lance? I doubt it was even real, Sir Giles said. He was red-faced, white-haired, and heavy now. It was just an old spear, nothing more. It's real, Thomas insisted, and that's why they came. Sir Giles did not argue. Your father, he said instead, would have wanted you to finish your studies. My studies are done, Thomas said flatly. "I'm going to France." Sir Giles nodded. He reckoned the boy was far better suited to be a soldier than a priest. "Will you go as an archer?" he asked, looking at the great bow on Thomas's shoulder. "Or do you want to join my house and train to be a man-at-arms?" He half smiled. "You're gently born, you know." "I'm bastard-born," Thomas insisted. "Your father was of good birth." "You know what family?" Thomas asked. Sir Giles shrugged. "He would never tell me, and if I pressed him, he would just say that God was his father and his mother was the church." "And my mother," Thomas said, "was a priest's housekeeper and the daughter of a bowyer. I shall go to France as an archer." "There's more honor as a man-at-arms," Sir Giles observed. But Thomas did not want honor. He wanted revenge. Sir Giles let him choose what he wanted from the enemy's dead, and Thomas picked a mail coat, a pair of long boots, a knife, a sword, a belt, and a helmet. It was all plain gear, but serviceable, and only the mail coat needed mending, for he had driven an arrow clean through its rings. Sir Giles said he owed Thomas's father money, which may or may not have been true, but he paid it to Thomas with the gift of a 4-year-old gelding. "You'll need a horse," he said, "for nowadays all archers are mounted. Go to Dorchester," he advised Thomas, "and like as not you'll find someone recruiting bowmen." The Genoese corpses were beheaded and their bodies left to rot, while their 4 heads were impaled on stakes and planted along the Hook's shingle ridge. The gulls fed on the dead men's eyes and pecked at their flesh until the heads were flensed down to bare bones that stared vacantly to the sea. But Thomas did not see the skulls. He had gone across the water, taken his black bow, and joined the wars. Part 1. Brittany. It was winter. A cold morning wind blew from the sea, bringing us our salt smell and a spitting rain that would inevitably sap the power of the bowstrings if it did not let up. "What it is," Jake said, "is a waste of goddamn time." No one took any notice of him. "Could have stayed in Brest," Jake grumbled. "Been sitting by a fire, drinking ale." Again he was ignored. "Funny name for a town," Sam said after a long while. "Brest. I like it, though." He looked at the archers. "Maybe we'll see the Blackbird again," he suggested. "Maybe she'll put a bolt through your tongue," Will Skeet growled, "and do us all a favor." The Blackbird was a woman who fought from the town walls every time the army made an assault. She was young, had black hair, wore a black cloak, and shot a crossbow. In the first assault, when Will Skeet's archers had been in the vanguard of the attack and had lost 4 men, they had been close enough to see the Blackbird clearly, and they had all thought her beautiful, though after a winter campaign of failure, cold, mud, and hunger, almost any woman looked beautiful. Still, there was something special about the Blackbird. "She doesn't load that crossbow herself," Sam said, unmoved by Skeet's surliness. "Of course she bloody doesn't," Jake said. "There ain't a woman born that can crack a crossbow." "Dozy Mary could," another man said. "Got muscles like a bullock, she has." "And she closes her eyes when she shoots," Sam said, still talking of the Blackbird. "I noticed." "That's because you weren't doing your goddamn job," Will Skeet snarled, "so shut your mouth some." Sam was the youngest of Skeet's men. He claimed to be 18, though he was really not sure, because he had lost count. He was a draper's son, had a cherubic face, brown curls, and a heart as dark as sin. He was a good archer, though. No one could serve Will Skeet without being good. "Right, lads," Skeet said. "Make ready." He had seen the stir in the encampment behind them. The enemy would notice it soon, and the church bells would ring the alarm, and the town walls would fill with defenders armed with crossbows. The crossbows would rip their bolts into the attackers, and Skeet's job today was to try to clear those crossbowmen off the wall with his arrows. Some chance, he thought sourly. The defenders would crouch behind their crenellations and so deny his men an opportunity to aim, and doubtless this assault would end as the 5 other attacks had finished, in failure. It had been a whole campaign of failure. William Boone, the Earl of Northampton, who led this small English army, had launched the winter expedition in hope of capturing a stronghold in northern Brittany, but the assault on Carix had been a humiliating failure. The defenders of Guingamp had laughed at the English, and the walls of Lannion had repulsed every attack. They had captured Tréguier, but as that town had no walls, it was not much of an achievement and no place to make a fortress. Now, at the bitter end of the year, with nothing better to do, the Earl's army had fetched up outside this small town, which was scarcely more than a walled village. But even this miserable place had defied the army. The Earl had launched attack after attack, and all had been beaten back. The English had been met by a storm of crossbow bolts, the scaling ladders had been thrust from the ramparts, and the defenders had exulted in each failure. "What is this goddamn place called?" Skeet asked. "La Roche-Derrien," a tall archer answered. "You would know, Tom," Skeet said. "You know everything." "That is true, Will," Thomas said gravely. "Quite literally true." The other archers laughed. "So if you know so bloody much," Skeet said, "tell me what this goddamn town is called again." "La Roche-Derrien." "Daft bloody name," Skeet said. He was grey-haired, thin-faced, and had known nearly 30 years of fighting. He came from Yorkshire and had begun his career as an archer fighting against the Scots. He had been as lucky as he was skilled, and so he had taken plunder, survived battles, and risen in the ranks until he was wealthy enough to raise his own band of soldiers. He now led 70 men-at-arms and as many archers, whom he had contracted to the Earl of Northampton's service, which was why he was crouching behind a wet hedge 150 paces from the walls of a town whose name he still could not remember. His men-at-arms were in the camp, given a day's rest after leading the last failed assault. Will Skeet hated failure. "La Roche what?" he asked Thomas. "Derriere. What does that goddamn mean?" "That, I confess, I do not know." "Sweet Christ!" Skeet said in mock wonder. "He doesn't know everything." "It is, however, close to Derriere, which means arse," Thomas added. "The Rock of the Arse is my best translation." End of Side 2. Side 3. Skeet opened his mouth to say something, but just then the first of La Roche-Derrien's church bells sounded the alarm. It was the crack bell, the one that sounded so harsh, and within seconds the other churches added their tolling, so that the wet wind was filled with their clangor. The noise was greeted by a subdued English cheer as the assault troops came from the camp and pounded up the road towards the town's southern gate. The leading men carried ladders, the rest had swords and axes. The Earl of Northampton led the assault, as he had led all the others, conspicuous in his plate armor, half covered by a surcoat, showing his badge of the lions and stars. "You know what to do!" Skeet bellowed. The archers stood, drew their bows, and loosed. There were no targets on the walls, for the defenders were staying low, but the rattle of the steel-tipped arrows on the stones should keep them crouching. The white-feathered arrows hissed as they flew. Two other archer bands were adding their own shafts, many of them firing high into the sky, so that their missiles dropped vertically onto the wall's top, and to Skeet it seemed impossible that anyone could live under that hail of feather-tipped steel. Yet as soon as the Earl's attacking column came within 100 paces, the crossbow bolts began to spit from the walls. There was a breach close to the gate. It had been made by a catapult, the only siege machine left in decent repair, and it was a poor breach, for only the top third of the wall had been dismantled by the big stones, and the townsfolk had crammed timber and bundles of cloth into the gap. But it was still a weakness in the wall, and the ladder men ran towards it, shouting as the crossbow bolts whipped into them. Men stumbled, fell, crawled, and died, but enough lived to throw 2 ladders against the breach, and the first men-at-arms began to climb. The archers were loosing as fast as they could, overwhelming the top of the breach with arrows. But then a shield appeared there, a shield that was immediately stuck by a score of shafts, and from behind the shield a crossbowman shot straight down one of the ladders, killing the leading man. Another shield appeared, another crossbow was loosed. A pot was shoved onto the breach's top, then toppled over, and a gush of steaming liquid spilled down to make a man scream in agony. Defenders were hurling boulders over the